I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. I Mix What I Like.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And today we're finally catching up with Dr. Tommy Curry, who, among many other things, is a professor of philosophy and critical race theory and black male studies and currently at Texas A&M University, where, among many other things, he is the author of the recently published book on Temple University Press, The Man Not: Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Dr. Tommy Curry, welcome to the program.
Thank you, brother. Thank you for having me.
So I thought we would start our, unfortunately, too short, what will be a too short conversation.
Right.
With something you wrote in the introduction to this book, which admittedly I haven't finished yet. There's a lot going on here, but so we'll have to have a part 2 and 3 and 4 later on. But I wanted to start here if we could. You write that race is not an efficacious category of analysis under our present intersectional and post-structural arrangement. Race is a category under constant disciplinary surveillance, exposing it to a seemingly infinite number of attacks for being overdetermined and essentialist, and therefore in need of any combination of experimental anti-essentialist solutions. I thought that if you could start by explaining what you mean there. Absolutely. And how that fits into what the work you've done here in this book.
First, I think that when we look at the trajectory of Black studies, as well as how we just think about the category of race, we see that as being the category that has to be problematized and policed. Nobody wants to be essentialist. No one wants to be caught thinking that race is real. If you do that, then it leads to people believing that your politics are in line with things like Black nationalism, Afrocentricity, and as you know, the mainstream, our liberal academy isn't too welcoming of those kinds of positions. So in effort to de-radicalize the category of Blackness, we like to perform what I call experiments. We like to say, well, we can pluralize Blackness with gender, because you know that racial essentialism that leads to politics of Black nationalism are already overtly masculine. And because it's overtly masculine, we know it's patriarchal. So in order for us to, because the way that we view the category is not really about the category of Blackness, but the politics that we attach to it, we end up saying that we need to pluralize the category that we think about with some other politics, which not only means that we have to pluralize it with things like feminism, we need to pluralize it with things like queer theory, etc. Now, the problem with that, though, is that it assumes that the category of race or Blackness is in itself not rich enough to deal with the plurality of Blackness that it presents itself with historically. So we see Black people as not having the kinds of techniques or the kinds of experiential knowledge that allows them to deal with things like gender, to deal with things like homosexuality. And by doing that, it's an identity politic that plays out in the academy, where Black men specifically don't have the ability to use race or racism to account for their experiences, because that's seen as one-dimensional or under the intersectional axis, a one-axis account. So my view is that race is constantly under scrutiny. And because of that, Black men have not been able to offer a gender analysis under that. But the problem is when you add in gender theory largely takes the experience of the woman to be synonymous with the category of gender. So then Black men become excluded from the combination of race and gender, because if you're male, it assumes that you have privilege. Now, while we may combine these things in intersectional analysis, it ends up being something like all men have privilege, Black men are Black, hence they experience racism. The combination of those two things means Black men experience lesser power than white males because they're Black. But that completely overlooks the history of Black men, and my book is trying to correct that by starting from the ground up.
Yeah, so you talk a little bit about what you describe them as myths of how Black men are characterized and approached, and then dealt with analytically. Could you draw that connection a little further for us? So if we go from this problem with dealing with race in this country, broadly speaking, how then does that play out in how we are both encouraged to see Black men, and then how the Black male experience is then interpreted, analyzed, organized around, etc.?
Well, I think a few things happen here. It's important to understand that the history of Black men being written about as a particular subject starts well before we even begin having conversations about intersectionality. People like Clive Franklin, people like Robert Staples, are making arguments alongside what we largely know as second wave feminism, trying to take into account the way that racism affects the experience of being a Black male in this society. What's end up happening is under our present gender frames, we end up doing things like saying men have power, men are bent on domination. So in an instance like intimate partner violence, Black men abuse Black women for power and domination, just like white men abuse white women. The problem with that is none of the studies done about that thesis, which is the Duluth model, which was written by Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar, accounted for any Black males. In fact, Ellen Pence later said in her life in 1999 that she made it up because she was involved with trying to get the Violence Against Women Act passed. So the politics behind giving the account of patriarchy and the Duluth model isn't based on clinical findings. It's based on the idea that they're trying to create a female subject, which Pence says their studies overlooked female to male violence and female violence against children in the same households. So we analytically align Black men with certain notions of patriarchy that leads to things like domestic violence, hypermasculinity, violence amongst each other. So I guess they use it to account for homicide rates as well, and give that an account of patriarchy, when in fact, in reality, what we're talking about is economic disparity, the effects of racism, the effects of internalized racism, etc. So we analytically approach Black men as being in line with a certain kind of politics and analysis that was never based on an empirical study of Black men and how they actually operate within their communities or within their own households.
So just real quick, you said she made it up.
Yes. So she wrote an article in 1999, said on my philosophy, right? The philosophy of the Duluth model. And she says that one of the flaws that they had with it is that it wasn't based on any clinical findings, but the mantras that the staff at Duluth were reciting to themselves about men coming into their centers. And she said that when her clinicians had to actually encounter men who were very regretful of beating their wives, or men who were victims of domestic abuse themselves, they didn't take time to actually process that clinical information. They continued with their ideology. So her argument was that there was no empiricism, right? And she says this was the chink in the armor, so to speak, that there was no clinical findings or empiricism behind the ideology that they were supporting. And because of that, they had to exclude things like female and male violence and child abuse. So the problem, as I say in my book in chapter 3, is that liberal arts has taken this analytic of male power without even analyzing the findings during the same period. So for example, the most stark example of this would be that at the same time that you're getting the development of the Duluth model in the early 1980s, you find that Black men are in fact the largest victims of intimate partner homicide, which is a trend that was established in the FBI data from 1976 to 1990. Secondary sources document the same finding, and no social scientist understands exactly why you had this high rate of spousal violence where Black females were killing Black males. Now, the general frame of explaining this is, of course, right, under feminist analysis, well, these women were protecting themselves. But you've always seen a disproportionate amount of bidirectional violence, meaning Black men attacking Black women attacking Black men, or Black women hitting first, attacking Black men responding throughout the Black community for the last 40 years. There hasn't been a lot of work done on it because no one's trying to actually give a causal theory or explanation for why Black people fight each other. So we end up, instead of trying to figure out the empirical situation in Black households and Black communities, simply reducing it down in liberal arts and current gender theory into Black men abused for power. But that's certainly not how domestic abuse operates in our very own communities.
So I just want to be clear, because somebody may hear what I think, not that I'm actually hearing, but what may be taken by some in quick passing, mm-hmm. that is, you're not suggesting that, or maybe I need to, maybe I need to go back and check on what you just said. Mm-hmm. You're not, because it almost sounds like you're suggesting that there's a misunderstanding, generally speaking, that we all hold on domestic violence and abuse.
Yes.
And let me go back to that part real quick. My bad, man. I just want to be clear.
So my argument. I don't want
anybody to hear this or watch
right.
say Dr. Curry is saying that that there really isn't the same kind of problem with black
No,
male violence against women that there is, or that we need to address.
No, that's not what I'm saying. No,
okay,
no,
yeah, right.
I'm saying,
I know.
no, I'm saying, in fact, there is that problem.
Right.
But that problem is complex because the causality, which is very simplistic, which is that black men just abuse for power, is wrong.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that the problem with domestic abuse in our communities is disproportionate on both sides. Okay. Black men do abuse black women disproportionately, but black women also disproportionately abuse black men. Black men disproportionately kill black women in intimate partner homicide, and black women also disproportionately kill black men.
Right.
And this cycle of violence within our households have a devastating effect because it's found that children that observe domestic abuse become abusers themselves. So what I am saying is that the problem is much bigger than we're talking about because the causality is given to us in a very narrow gender frame.
And your argument is that narrow gender frame is just about
male perpetration,
male issue about power and
yes.
not taking into
not about economics, not about recidivism, not about drug abuse, not about histories of previous trauma, not about internalized racism. So I am not arguing that this is not a problem in our communities. I'm arguing the exact opposite. That is much more complex. And we have data to suggest that it's not only complex in terms of incidence or lifetime prevalence, where you have 5.1 million black men who suffer from intimate partner violence, but also in terms of the causalities that have not been addressed, which is why this remains a huge problem. And this doesn't stem just from us not reading, that's a big part, because we just haven't read the research in intimate partner violence studies or conflict studies. But it's also because we define everything based on bell hooks interpretation of male power. We're not actually looking at the dynamics that happen within households. I actually recently got a call from a brother that's working in social work. He works on prisoners reentry. And he called me up and he's like, I read some of your work and heard you speak on intimate partner violence and female perpetrated violence against black males. I say, yes, how can I help you? And he's like, look, we're having a real problem because these brothers that come out of jail and that's on parole, they're being victimized by the women that they're living with, because they're saying that if they say anything about it, they're going to call their parole officer, they're going to go back to jail. So we have a lot of different dynamics in our community that make black men vulnerable, be it from poverty or be it from incarceration, that's not being addressed when we look at black men or the position that black men are put in next to their spouses in low socioeconomic conditions.
Right, and thank you for that clarification.
Absolutely.
I didn't assume that's what you were saying, but I thought for a minute it might.
Right, people may perceive.
Right, yeah. I just wanted to be clear. And we
know how the internet goes.
Yeah, and it came up. I saw you recently on with Yvette Carnell.
Yes.
And and one of the things that I liked about that conversation was that she is always wanting to highlight people who have numbers and and data to support their mm-hmm. arguments, and you've clearly done that here. And it was interesting that conversation was centered around, if I remember correctly, her critique of how we understand economics and where black men and women fit into the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, sort of as a way to segue, unfortunately, to the end of our conversation, if I could ask you about the title of chapter 3
mm-hmm.
that you just referenced, and then how it relates to the title of the book. That is, chapter 3 is titled The Political Economy of Niggerdom, Racist Misandry, Class Warfare, Racist Misandry, Class Warfare, and the Disciplinary Propagation of the Super Predator Mythology.
Yes, sir.
How does that relate first to this title of your book, The Man Not, Race, Class, I just missed race, class, and genre, Dilemmas of Black Manhood.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And how this predator mythology and
mm-hmm.
how does that, and then how does that relate according, of course, not just to the title of your book, but how then we interpret the black male experience, material lived experience,
mm-hmm.
and but yeah, please, if we could start with what you're doing in chapter 3 and then the title of your book.
Absolutely. So let me begin. When I talk about racist misandry, or other black male scholars as well, we sometimes say anti-black misandry.
Mm-hmm.
What we're talking about is the collective ideas or beliefs in the hyper expression or hyper personality, so hypersexuality, hypermasculinity of black men. And this is used as a kind of logics to justify the disposability of Black males. Now, taking that view, it is my position that this has been the dominant frame of how we look at Black men, even within theory. So while we may have views of Black men that says, for instance, they suffer from racism, when we talk about their politics, when we talk about the ideas or paradigms that have been created by Black males, they've always been flawed because they have in some way either excluded or been detrimental to women. I argue throughout the text that this view is in fact not new, that this is the product of a very rich and long-standing colonial history. You can look back to the debates in 1868 in the history of suffrage by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And part of the argument for why Black men should not have the right to vote is because they are a tyrannical class. And if they got the right to vote, they would abuse and whip their women. So this idea, I just find it coincidental that this idea that Black men are violent towards women, that if they get political rights, that somehow leads to them oppressing women as a whole class, is the same arguments we were having 100 years later in the 1960s and 70s. So utilizing that historical analysis, as well as the way that colonial societies have always created the myth of the racialized or native rapist, is my suggestion that these codes have been brought in, kind of snuck in it like a Trojan horse of the concept of gender. So the gender concept, which allows us to have notions of female vulnerability, has allowed us to see that in relationship to men, especially primitive or racialized men, as being that colonial relation, the rapist, the abuser, the violator, etc. So when we see accounts of intersectional thought, or when we see feminist accounts, both Black and white, what we see is that hypermasculinity then expresses itself as a personality of domination, even when these Black men are oppressed. So whereas Black women's oppression leads them to have a more rigid, rich, and epistemologically full view of oppression, so they study race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc., Black men are purely defined by their lack. Black men are not men, hence their oppression only means that they focus on attaining male power. So we don't look at Black men as offering treatises on sexual violence. We don't look at Black men as having experiences of sexual vulnerability, despite we know Black men being raped. So what we see analytically is that even though Black men went through the exact same sexual violences that Black women did, on top of that, experiencing the myth of the Black rapist and being lynched for these types of things, there is no experiential toolbox that Black men allegedly offer in under our current orders of knowledge that allow them to explore gender on their own terms. Now, this is very different than what happens when you're looking at what's going on in the UK, if you're looking at what's going on in Australia, because even people like R.W.S. Connell, who invented the term of hegemonic masculinity, has admitted that working class white men are much more egalitarian than ruling class white men. She says that these are resistory masculinities, that people who are victims of imperialism and colonization are subordinated, and they, because she's using a neo-Marxist frame, right? She's using Gramsci, these people actually fight against hegemonic masculinity. Now, we use hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity to describe Black men, and these people are the ancestors of slaves. But allegedly, they're not even as analytically rich and resistory towards hegemonic masculinity as white people in the same colonial settler society as the white men that just work for people that colonized. So the concept itself doesn't make sense. So in the political economy of niggerdom, what I'm talking about are the market forces that allow us to cast Black men as patriarchs, even though the very theories we utilize, like hegemonic masculinity, say the exact opposite. Because if we were being generous, Black men would be subordinate non-hegemonic masculinities under Connell's paradigm. Those people don't perpetuate patriarchy. They could be violent, aggressive, etc., but they're not ruling class. So they don't have the same kind of investment in perpetuating ideal masculinities as you would somebody who's middle class or upper class. And remember, when she first does this study in 1982, she's talking about Australian boys that's in boarding school that's trying to mobilize throughout society, which is why she came up with this formulation of hegemonic masculinity initially. We've imported that concept without any kind of analysis or economic analysis of where Black men fit in relationship to work. Where do Black men fit in relationship to poverty? We haven't even asked the question, let's go interview some of these poor Black men and see where they actually align regarding their attitudes towards women, masculinity, etc. And the few studies that we do have, like Hunter and Davis's piece, suggest that Black men don't even believe in a notion of masculinity. They speak more in terms of manhood, that they see themselves as interrelated to their families, communities, and the responsibilities they have to their race. That is not in any previous masculinity literature as being individualistic. It doesn't fit with the way that people like Kimmel, etc., are describing American or Western masculinity. So even when Connell who actually cites Robert Stable's work, says Robert Stable's book on Black masculinity is amazing, and it achieves the same thing that Messersmith's analysis about poor working class men in the West does, meaning that they don't reproduce hegemonic masculinities. We've not even paid attention to what she cited in her own book as the discord between men who are victims of colonization and imperialism and people and white ruling class men. We just say Black men are mimetic, that they just want to imitate their oppressors. So I say that this is not an issue that is factual, or this is not something that's been built up in previous literature. This is simply the way that certain gender frames have chose to incentivize interpreting Black males in that way. So throughout chapter 3, why I call it the political economy of niggerdom, is when you analyze the super predator mythology, you see that the insidious anti-Blackness of it still resonates within the theories of accounting for what Black men actually intend to do. So Black men, when they get economic power, will betray women. They want to be like white men. Black men who are poor, that don't have money, well, they want to be rich, so they abuse women. Black men who feel that they're insulted and have no way out, well, they kill other Black men. Black men who don't have power in society to get recognition, well, they hate homosexuals. So the same super predator myth that we will say is racism, if a white person says it, right? That if a white person says a Black man is a rapist, a murderer, that's racism. But you put that very same analysis under a gender category, well, Black men are hegemonic, they're abusive. Because they're fighting for power, they end up hurting or extinguishing or competing with other men. We say, well, that's fine because that's gender theory. So you can code the exact same negative stereotypes about Black males under two different categories. Under race is rejected, but under gender it's accepted. And that's why I argue that it's been incentivized and snuck into many of the ways that we analyze the group itself.
So as we as a concluding sort of thought, then how would you then suggest we interpret what's going on now? So we hear a lot of conversation, whether it's around Black Lives Matter, whether it's around violence in Chicago, whether it's around mass incarceration or police brutality in general, or people finding ways to struggle, as the prominence of intersectionality prevails. You know, what would then you suggest we do, or what does your book then suggest we do, analytically at least, to better understand what's going on?
Well, two things happen in the book. First, I think we have to diagnose the logic of intersectionality that's actually being utilized by Black Lives Matter. It's not just intersectionality. It's actually a theory that was introduced in 2008 under the term of intersectional invisibility. So the logic of intersectional invisibility suggests, and this is from the actual article, that Black men are non-prototypical men, in this case because they're responding to Sidineus' theory of social dominance, actually have privilege in a patriarchal society. Because they are more prototypical, like the patriarch, because they are male, they are also killed more. So the indication of their privilege is in fact their death. I find that to be a deplorable frame of understanding males. And let me explain why. If it is the case that non-prototypical men or racialized men are killed because they're more like the patriarch, and that is an indication of their privilege, while in the exact same society, women who are killed by the patriarch, even if they align with the race of the dominant male class, is subordinated, then it means that there is no value or there is no calculus by which we can ascertain the disadvantage of men within that society. So even in a case like genocide, we would suggest that men are targeted in acts of genocide because they're more prototypical to the genocidal males that are incurring the force. Said differently, it means that no amount of violence or force can ever indicate the levels of oppression that males suffer in a patriarchal society. Violence is only indicative for the oppression that females suffer in that society. So that contradiction is what runs throughout the ways that we've seen some of the popular discourses about say her name versus say his name perform throughout Black Lives Matter. So even though you have disparities, huge disparities, in the numbers of Black men that are killed per year, right, between 290 to 300 in some cases, versus in low years, 9 to say 20 of Black women, the argument becomes, well, Black men are patriarchal when you talk about them because you're centering your attention of them. That's the way that we say it in terms of our hashtag. But what you're really saying is that Black men are patriarchal because our attention to them is focusing on men in a patriarchal society, because those men are killed because they're men. So we have to focus on non-prototypical bodies, which would be females. Now, I find this whole kind of calculus silly, because what we're ultimately talking about in terms of police brutality is the imposition of one group having power over another group. And the fact that males are disproportionately affected by it doesn't mean that they're privileged. It means that we have to create new frames to understand why patriarchal societies target racialized men. Luckily, this analysis has already been done by people like Jim Sidanaeus, who argues that in patriarchal society, capitalistic patriarchal societies, the biggest threats to racial endogamy, the ability of white people to reproduce and marry other white people, are racialized males, which is why we see more lethal violence historically throughout the world, not just Black people, but also in Muslims and immigrant racial populations directed towards that group. He calls that the subordinate male target hypothesis. So there are theories that have answered intersectionality. Intersectional visibility was actually written as a response to social dominance theory because of just the wealth of empirical evidence that was put forth by Sidanaeus. But at the same time, this has not made its way to humanities and liberal arts. So what the Man Not tries to do is supplement Sidanaeus' work in terms of the lethality in terms of the lethal violence that racialized men suffer in patriarchal societies, with an analysis of the sexual history that makes them vulnerable. And the Man Not, suggesting they are not men, not human, and always in a dehumanized position in relation to other bodies, is an extension of those clinical findings or psychological findings in relationship to history, economics, domestic abuse, and archival research, which talks about the invention of gender or the development of gender through the 19th century.
All right, so I'm going to try one concluding thought. You tell me how close I am to getting it right, and then we'll have to get out of here for now. In other words, if I understand what you're arguing here, despite some popular conversation, Black men don't have a particular power over Black women and suffer higher rates of violence from the state, not because they have a particular power over Black women, but because they have they present a particular threat to the ability of white people to reproduce. Is that what?
That would be Sidanaeus'. That's close. That's Sidanaeus' view of social dominance. Right. My view would be that the higher levels of violence that Black men experience, lethal violence, be it homicide, police brutality, incarceration, unemployment, underemployment, etc., is the result of a framework of white supremacy that utilizes patriarchy to identify racialized males as threats to not only the biological reproduction of the white race, but also the cultural reproduction of themselves. And we see this not only in terms of Sidanaeus' work in social dominance, but also the historical reproduction of racist tropes. When we do comparative analysis with something like the Holocaust, we see that Nazis made the exact same argument against Jewish men. So what I am arguing is that the Man Not frame and the concept of phallicism, which I'm developing in the second book, can be used to explain how in Western capitalist patriarchal societies, racially subjugated males end up being the largest victims of patriarchy in terms of lethal violence.
Well, Dr. Tommy Curry, there's a lot you put on the table, a lot for us to digest, and we will have to continue this conversation another time. I greatly appreciate you coming on with us and breaking this down. Look forward to getting more deeply into the book. The book again, The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Dr. Tommy Curry, to you and all our audience, as always, we say thanks for joining us. And to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. So peace, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind. Thanks a lot, my man. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.